Hello viewers, welcome to La Excellence. Today we are going to discuss about India and Africa relations. So here we are going to discuss about this particular part because it has come in the current affairs recently. So that is the reason why we are discussing regarding India and Africa relations. So there was a foundation known as Vivekananda International Foundation. This is a think tank, New Delhi based think tank. So here they've actually, it has an African expert group. So these people have released a India and Africa partnership, like how India and Africa partnership is there, and what are the achievements it had, and what are the challenges, and what is the roadmap for 2023. So that is the reason why we are discussing. So when we look at India and Africa, so the first thing it comes to our brain is India and Africa relations are not just the recent ones which have started. India and Africa relationships were started way back in our historically. So the Gandhi, when we look at our freedom fighter Gandhi, he was somebody who experimented his satyagraha in Africa, that is in South Africa itself. And also we have so much of diaspora in South Africa. So our relations with Africa was a very age-old thing. So we have a kind of good diaspora also in Africa, and also we have a kind of experiment. So Gandhi was equally famous in African countries, especially in South Africa, and also like the way he is in India, he is also equally famous there because he is the one who fought for Indian diaspora in Africa. So here that is the relations we have started way back. We have a long relationship with African countries, and also these African countries are also one of the developing countries. So these are one of the developing countries and also rich in resources. So here, okay, they are rich in resources and they are developing countries, and we Indians, we in our country, we want to become one of the global power. When India wants to be one of the global power, then in that case, we need to have a kind of good relationships with the African cooperation is very much needed, because here Africa is richer in resources, and also Africa has a kind of uneven kind of governments. When we look at Africa, it does not have every country in whole Africa does not have democratic governments. Some countries like Somalia, Sudan, everywhere we have so much of turmoil. There is so much of dictatorship turmoils which are going on in certain countries in Africa, and countries like South Africa and all, they have democratic countries. They have democracy. It means in Africa they have uneven kind of political system which is prevalent in African countries. And also in India, we are somebody, according to our foreign policy, we support certain countries which are actually striving towards democracy. And also here in Africa, we have so much of influence of China. So there is so much of infrastructural China's influence in Africa, and also Russia, and especially Russian private group. Wagner group has so much of influence in Africa. So, and also many other countries like US. So all the global powers or all the developed countries are influencing in Africa because it is rich in resources, and also it is the country where it does not have a even political system. That is, it does not have a democratic political system in all the countries. When we talk about African continent as such, in some countries have a democratic polity and some countries are still in the dictatorship governments. So here that is a reason when India wants to be a kind of rising global power, so when China and Russia and other US and other global powers are trying to capture the African market or African countries as such, in the cooperation of India is also needed, because we have a age old kind of relationship with the African countries. So that is the reason. And also when we look at defense and security cooperation, so when we look at Africa here and India here, we have Indian Ocean, and also here Indian Ocean Rim. So we have a kind of security cooperation also, because in this Indian Ocean, and which is part of India and Africa, and those countries which are the Indian Ocean bordering countries, so we need to have a kind of good security cooperation, because that is how we can establish a kind of good maritime security in the Indian Ocean. And also recently, trilateral maritime exercise was started between Tanzania and Mozambique, with Tanzania and Mozambique countries of Africa. So here it means we are trying to improve the defense and security cooperation with Africa, because it has a Indian Ocean rim, and there are certain countries which are part of Indian Ocean and India, and when certain countries are part of Indian Ocean rim, we need to have a kind of security cooperation with Africa, and also economic cooperation, because Africa is a very good market for our trade. So here we need to have a good kind of economic it is a kind of good economic market, because African countries are those countries which are not completely industrialized. So here they are developing countries, or some are really completely underdeveloped. In that case, for India, it is a kind of good market for our countries, where we can actually go and sell our goods. And especially when we look at Indian goods and all, our generic goods, especially our generic and pharmaceutical health sector goods, are very, very famous in African countries, because here generic drugs are those drugs which are actually which are like made by private countries, like without any patent, to provide for those countries where they do not have to provide for those poor countries where they cannot afford the high prices of drugs, because generic drugs are Indianized drugs of those drugs which are patented. So these patented drugs are we make it in generic form and we sell it, and where for us African countries are a very good market. And also we have so much of educational exchange program with the students also. So and also recently telemedicine and also tele-education was started specially for African countries, and there are so many African students who have come into India, and they come and they actually have education here. So that is something, we have a kind of good cooperation when we talk about educational and the skill development, and also infrastructure projects. So because those countries, many of those countries are the poorly developed countries, so we need to give them a kind of infrastructure project, so that we'll become a kind of big brother in the African countries as well, because India wants to achieve a global power. In that case, establishing infrastructural projects there was also important equally for us as when we look at our security issues also, and as such when we want to be a global power also, that is equally important. And also to reduce the Chinese influence, because China is involved so much of infrastructural projects in Africa, and also India is presently is involved, but it needs to be enhanced. And Africa is rich in resources, minerals and resources. As we all know that Africa, when we look at African continent, it is something which is rich in gold, diamonds, crude oil. And when we want to diversify our crude oil imports, in that case Africa is a very good source. And also we have so much of people to people cooperation, this trilateral cooperation, that is maritime cooperation. So all these are the areas of India and African cooperation which are presently there and which can be enhanced, because we have so much of competition from China, Russia, US and other countries. That is the reason why the cooperation with Africa needs to be enhanced. And also, what are the challenges we have? Like the way we have a trade imbalance. Before, we used to have a trade imbalance in 2021, but in 2022 we had a kind of favorable trade when it came to African countries, because our trade imports have increased. But in 2021 we were in deficit. But later, right now, according to this particular Vivekananda's International Foundation report, according to this, right now we are in the favorable exports. So it means we are exporting more compared to our imports. And also, to curtail Chinese dominance also, India's cooperation with African countries need to be increased. And also infrastructural development is something which is very, very important. As we can see that security cooperation, infrastructural development is very important with the African countries, because to curtail the Chinese influence, we need to increase more of infrastructural development, because as I told you guys, that they have uneven political system in Africa. So Africa does not have a even political system. So when the countries have uneven political system, if at all we give a kind of infrastructural development there, so India would become a kind of country where they would be dependent upon. So in that case, we will be a country where it will be powerful in the whole world, when we can become a kind of global power. And also security cooperation is needed, because as we can see that when it comes to African countries, these are the one which are famous for drugs and crime. So we get to see in the movies also that when we talk about drug trafficking, there are so much of African countries which are involved more of drug trafficking itself. So here there is a need for more regional and international cooperation to control this drugs and crimes which are happening in African countries. And there the crime rate is high because they do not have a strong political system, because there it is all, as many countries are filled with so much of turmoil and so much of fights are going on in African countries. So that is the reason why it does not, why the crime rate is very high in the African countries. And yes, it has a political and governance challenges, as they do not have a proper political system. And what could be the way forward between the India and Africa? So we need to have a kind of more of political and diplomatic cooperation towards Africa, and also defense and security cooperation has to be improved, and also economic and developmental cooperation, because recently only we have actually increased our trade deficit was reduced with African countries. Trade deficit was reduced, so which needs to be made in such a way that it is, as it is a good market for Indian goods, so that should not be reduced. Because recently a controversy was erupted where because of a cough syrup in the African countries, there were many kids who have died because of the Indian made cough syrup. So if at all we want to increase more of our economic and development cooperation, that point of time India needs to be very careful when it is actually exporting certain goods to the African markets, because our generic drugs are the one which are very popular in the African countries. As we have a culturally, there is so much of diaspora in Africa, so the social and cultural cooperation between India and Africa is also equally important. And also when it comes to giving of visas to the African students, that needs to be enhanced, and at least they should be given a kind of work permit in India to do after their education. And also there should be a kind of special fund for African to improve the cooperation. We need to have a kind of fund specially for African fund, which can be made specially to increase the kind of cooperation between the India and Africa. So as we can see that India and Africa both are those countries which can be grown together, as they both are the developing countries, and India has to see Africa as a kind of good potential continent, as such, where it can actually show it a kind of global power, where it can show that it's a kind of global power, because Africa has we have so much of diaspora in Africa, and also we have so much of markets in Africa. So that is something which India can do when it comes to the Africa. So that is regarding the India and African relations. So see you all in the next class with a new topic. Thank you.